loop as opposed to the for in. I can take control of how the iteration goes. I can also step through and play every other item or display every other item in the playlist because I have more control over how things are iterated, how things are initialized, and so on. Okay? Do you need to iterate through an indeterminate number of times based on some logic that's inside of the body of the loop itself? Then you probably either want to use the while statement or the do while. The do while we've already seen, it'll at least execute the passage of code or the block of code one time. All right, so those are your 4 different looping statements that are available in JavaScript. Hopefully now some of those previous exercises, if you were to go back and look at them, if they didn't make a lot of sense before, they should make sense now that we've talked about looping and arrays. All right, so let's continue pushing forward, doing great. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we'll talk about global scope versus function scope. And the idea is simple and the video is short because I don't want to make it seem any harder than it really is. However, if you're coming from a programming background, JavaScript may not behave the way that you might expect it to in this regard. For example, if you're a C# or Visual Basic programmer, undoubtedly you have some familiarity with the notion of a block level scope. However, JavaScript has its own unique rules around scope, namely function scope, which disregards the block of code where a variable is declared and allows it to be used or referenced anywhere inside of the function. Now, if you're not already a programmer, scope simply refers to the context, or rather the availability of a given variable inside of your code. If the variable is defined with a global scope, it'll be available anywhere in your JavaScript code. And remember, the way you define a global variable is to simply start using it without the use of the var keyword. However, variables that are defined with the var keyword, function scope variables inside of a function, can only be seen and utilized inside of that function. So what we're going to do in this lesson is just create a couple of examples to fully flesh this out, and so we're on the same page and we understand the ins and outs of scope. And there might be a wrinkle or two as we continue on in the series, but I think we're going to find that those edge cases are fairly simple to understand once we get this basic concept down. So as you can see, I've already taken the liberty of getting started. I have used our template to create a new web page called c9js_10.html. I've already replaced the h1 in the title, and I've already added the script type equals text JavaScript and the closing script tag, and I'm ready to go. So please pause the video if you need to catch up, but please follow along. All right, I'm going to assume you're ready to go. So the first thing that we need to do is debunk the notion of block scope in JavaScript. So the easiest way that I can figure out to demonstrate this is to create a block, a simple block like the if statement. And inside of that if statement, I'm just going to create a variable x equals 5. Now in any other programming language, we would expect once we get outside of that block of code, once we exited that block of code, the variable x would no longer be available. However, in JavaScript, that's just not true. And to see that in action, I create an alert box to reference that variable x, and it displays 5 in a message box. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. Now let's create a slightly more interesting set of examples here and actually start utilizing a global variable. So we're going to call this one my scope equals global, and then I'm going to create an anonymous function, and then I'm going to call that anonymous function immediately. We saw this in the previous lesson where we were looking at the different ways to create functions and to execute them. So just to set this up, there's my anonymous function, and I'm going to wrap it in a set of parentheses, and then I'm going to invoke this function immediately by using another set of parentheses, which in that case become the function invocation operators. All right. So then inside of this, what I want to do, first of all, is just let's alert and show the global scope. So inside the function, the scope is my scope. And then outside of the function, we'll do the same thing, except outside the function, the scope is my scope. Great. All right, so let's see what happens. All right, so inside the function, the scope is global, and outside the function, the scope is global. And that makes sense, right? Because we're dealing with a global variable, define it without the var keyword, and so it's available anywhere within our code. So now let's do this. I'm going to comment that out for the moment and not even reference it. Inside, I'm going to create a var myScope equals function. And then we're going to see if we can see that variable outside of the scope of the function. Inside the function, the scope is function, and then we don't get a second alert box. And the reason is because my scope at this point is undefined. Therefore, this whole line of code is ignored by JavaScript because you can't append undefined to a string. There's no way to convert it. Two different types, I guess you would say. All right, so I guess that makes sense, right? Now let's do something else here. Let's uncomment out these the original declaration of my scope, the global declaration. Will we see the overwriting of my scope once we get down here back to the global scope? Let's see what happens. All right, so inside the function, the scope is function. So we overwrite the global variable in this case, but once we get outside of the function, notice that the variable's value goes back to its global value. All right, so I think that is one of the key takeaways, that you can temporarily override the value of a variable by merely redefining it inside of a function, but it won't affect the variable outside of the scope of that particular function. We can reassign the value of a global variable inside of a function. So I set this inside the function. Save that and rerun it. All right, so inside the function, the scope is I set this inside the function, and globally it has been changed as well. All right, so that makes sense too, right? It's accessible. The global variable is accessible inside and outside of all the code. From this point on, we can reassign its value. All right, one last case here. Let's do this. And we really only need this. And this is just an extension of how we started this whole discussion. Here I'm creating a block of code immediately inside of my function. Here's the var keyword, so we're creating a local variable called myScope, but we're going to reference it outside of the block that we define here, the if statement. So let's see how that works. And so once again, proving that block scope is irrelevant, even though it's defined inside of the if statement. What happens is this process called hoisting, where JavaScript will look through the body of your code and it will hoist any variable declarations to the top of the function, so it'll make it available throughout the entire function. All right, and you can learn more about hoisting and the process of that in a more advanced video series, or many articles online. Okay, one last little tidbit of information. We haven't really talked about the document object model yet, but all variables that are defined at a global scope belong to the document object model window, which is the topmost object inside of the document object model. So we can do something like this. Let's do that. Let's get rid of everything inside here for the moment. start afresh. All we have available right now is my scope equals global, and I'll go to the very bottom of this example and type in alerts window dot my scope. So window owns my scope, or we're going to test it anyway, and we're going to access the window object's my scope property or value. And let's see what we get if this actually indeed works. And it does. All right, and again, this might make a little more sense once we talk about the document object model in more depth. All right, so hopefully we've completely looked at all the cases with regards to global versus functional scope. Hopefully there's no ambiguity in your mind how this all works and the scope of variables that you define within your functions and outside of your functions, the use of var and the exclusion of the word var. Okay? All right, so let's continue on. You're doing great. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to talk about working with external JavaScript files. Up until now, we've seen two different ways of adding JavaScript to our web pages. The first was inline, and just to remind you what I mean by that, it's where we did the onload equals alert hi from inline. So we added our JavaScript right inside of our body tag through the use of the onload attribute. That was one way to add the code. The other way was through a script tag. And this is what we've been doing all along. And so inside of here, we were able to type in hi from script tag. And so let's just see those in action, because I'm going to delete them here really quick. Hi from script tag, hi from inline. Okay? And in both of those cases, I made the point of saying, let's go ahead and just delete that. I made the point of saying that that this is not the right way to add JavaScript to your web pages. I did it to keep things simple, but from now on we're going to be taking the correct approach. The right way to add JavaScript to your application is to add it to one or more external files that only contain JavaScript. The convention that most developers use is to add a file extension with the .js at the end, but I don't believe that's a requirement. Let me show you what I mean by this. So first of all, let's go ahead and continue to use our script tag. We're just going to add an additional attribute, src for source. And in this case, we'll just keep our source file in the same directory as our HTML page. So I'll just type in script.js. Right now, we need to create a script.js file. So here I'm just going to type alert hello from script.js. I'm going to save this in my desktop, fundamentals folder, all files, script.js, save. All right, so now let's see this in action. You can see our new script file. You can see that in my particular case, it's recognized as a JScript file. Let's not worry too much about that file type. Let's just go ahead and double click our web page that references it, and you can see that we get the message hello from script.js. Great. In fact, we can reference more than one script file, and you often will do that. I'm just going to copy its entire line of code and then just change the source to another .js, and then I'm going to save this as another .js, So now we have two files, and I just want to change what this one says, another.js. All right. So if we were to open up c9js11.html, we get hello from script.js, hello from another.js. All right. Okay, so the big question you should be asking yourself is why this emphasis? Why are we switching gears here? Why are we emphasizing to only write code in external JavaScript files? Well, using external JavaScript files has a couple of big advantages. First of all, it keeps a clean separation of concerns. Ideally, the content will be kept in the HTML files. Ideally, the presentation of that content will be kept in the CSS or cascading style sheet files. And the behavior will be kept in JavaScript or .js files. So why is this important? Well, generally, a clean separation of concerns is a software development principle established decades ago that helped to make code more manageable and maintainable. Also, from an end user perspective, there are many different clients of web pages, from 10-year-old phones with rudimentary web browsers to old web browsers to screen readers for people with vision disabilities. So keeping your HTML free of any presentation or behavior allows for a wider audience to consume your content. And then secondly, it keeps your code reusable so that it can be ported into multiple projects. For example, we're going to look at the jQuery library soon. And there are other JavaScript libraries that are available. In fact, many are available. And they're reusable because all the code belonging to that library has been kept in its own separate .js file. So you can create your own libraries for personal use or for the company that you work for, or share them on the web in the same way. Furthermore, we're going to see a little bit later on how using an external JavaScript file is just one step towards our effort at making our JavaScript code unobtrusive. And so we'll learn about how to keep from polluting the global scope, or rather the global namespace, in an upcoming lesson, and that will round out our knowledge on the topic. But from this point on, we're only going to be using external JavaScript files because I want you and I both to be in the habit of following this best practice. So from now on, you and I are not allowed to write any JavaScript code in our HTML pages, okay? Got it? All right, so that's all I wanted to say in this lesson. We'll build on this idea as we move forward. See you in the next lesson. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we'll talk about object literals, which will help us organize and simplify the JavaScript code that we write. Now, in JavaScript, an object is simply a structure with a open and closing curly brace and a name. And inside of there, we can define properties, which are like attributes or variables, as well as methods, which are simply functions that define some behavior, okay? From that point on, those properties and methods function as a coherent unit. So this helps to collect related information and behavior together into one spot and then make it portable and reusable. Object literals are used everywhere in modern JavaScript development, and you'll see the structure that we're going to demonstrate often whenever you're doing software development, especially in jQuery with its plugins and passing in objects full of property settings that we want to configure the given plugin with. More on that later, okay? So here again, if you're coming from a different programming background, JavaScript has quite a different take on objects. In many programming languages, you create classes first, which are like blueprints for a data type. And then you create new instances of the class, and that produces an object. However, in JavaScript, there are no classes per se. You attach properties and methods to objects as needed. So if two or more objects need to support a given method, you can use the object's prototype to enable a form of inheritance. However, since this is a fundamental series, we're not going to be covering that topic because it's a bit more advanced. Traditionally, classes and objects are the basis for an object-oriented style of programming or approach. However, JavaScript lends itself to a more functional style over a true object-oriented style. So you may have to check your assumptions at the door on how things should work, even though you'll see some of the same sorts of terminology and even some of the same keywords used in JavaScript as used in Visual Basic, C# or some other programming language that you might be familiar with already. Okay, so just kind of pause any of your current thoughts about how objects are used, because chances are it'll be slightly different and you'll just start making assumptions that are not true if you follow along your previous experience and training in that regard. All right, so let's set up our examples. After a few examples, I think you'll get the hang of how things are different. So you can see that I've already taken the liberty of creating our HTML page. So I've used our template to create a new HTML page called c9js_12.html. You can see that I've already set the title and the H1 like usual. Here I've created, featuring the technique we demonstrated in the previous lesson, our reference to an external script that I called script12.js. And over here you can see I have script12.js already open and ready for us to start typing. So I'm going to assume that you've paused the video, that you've caught up, and that you are planning on following along, right? Okay, so here we go. We're going to create a very, very simple object literal to start off with one property and one method. All right, so it's as easy as that. We are creating a structure by defining an opening, closing curly brace, and then setting our var called batwing. So the name of our object is batwing. It'll have one property and one method. The property we've defined is basically a variable, and inside of that variable we've initialized the value to ready. To separate one member of our object from another member of our object, we'll use the comma operator. So here we've defined a method that has been set. The body of the method is defined as an anonymous function. Inside of the anonymous function, we're merely using the document.write function to just print something to screen. All right, so now this is how we have created the object. What if we need to reference the values and the method of this object? Let's set up a simple example here. Notice that I'm starting by using the name of the object, then we're going to use this dot notation, which is the member accessor operator. So we want to access a member of our batwing object, namely the status property. So if the Batwing status is ready, then we want to go ahead and rescue Batman. Simple as that. All in a day's work. All right, so let's go ahead and execute our application, and if I spelled everything correctly, it should work, and it does. It checked to see the status of the Batwing, and the Batwing was ready, and therefore it launched the rescue Batman method. Okay? All right, so let's create a second object literal. We're going to call this utilities. And it'll only support one method for now. And I just want to show that you can use an object as an input parameter to another function or method on another object. And in this case, what I'm going to do is take that target object, and I'm going to loop through and look at all of its members, its properties, and its methods that have been defined. And so, when you have object literals in JavaScript, you can simply loop through all of the members of that object by just doing a for in statement. Then, once you want to get to one individual member, all you do, let's set it up a little bit here. I'm going to add a line break between them. All you do is just use target object and then use the index of the element or the item inside of that given object. So let's do this now. We're going to pass our batwing object literal to the print all members method of our utilities object literal. And just because I don't need to see this again, I'm going to comment that part out. Save it. Now let's see if it runs. Hopefully I typed everything correctly. All right, so this is what we get. We have two entries here at the very top of our page because of the document.write just prints off, streams it out to the very top. Here we get the value of our first property inside of our batwing object. The value is ready. And then we see the definition for the rescue Batman method of our batwing. Notice it didn't execute it. We didn't ask it to execute it because we didn't use the execution operator. But it merely prints out its definition. Okay, that's kind of neat. So let's do one more thing here. I'm going to comment that out, and I'm going to just define an empty object literal. And then let's use our print all members to see if there's anything inside of it by default. And I wouldn't expect there to be, but let's just see what happens. All right, and there's not. But I think the moral of this story is that you can create an empty object literal and then later on attach properties and methods to it at some later point in time, and we'll demonstrate how to do that in just a moment. Let me comment that out. But in its simplest form, you can create an object literal with this syntax. Let's create a slightly more advanced example. Let's create a planet, let's say for like a game. And first of all, we'll create an ID. Notice I'm using a data type of number. Notice that I'm separating each of the members with a comma operator. Now this one is kind of interesting. What if I want to embed one object literal inside of another object literal? I can simply do it like this. Awesome. Okay. So here we have an object literal complete with two properties and one method, and it is defined as a property of another object. Cool. Something else that's kind of neat, a more complex version here, is any cities that are in this planet. I can use an array, and that array can contain other object literals. Notice I didn't put these on separate lines because they're going to be so short. I can just inline them all like so. It's obvious to the eye what's going on here, I think. But you could separate them out on other lines and do indentation if you wanted to.